So with that, the floor is open now for any questions. If anyone has them, either please feel free to put them in the chat, or if you'd like to go live on air, you can raise your hand and ask your question out loud. I might abuse my position as chair here and ask the first question if that's all right, while we wait for more to come. So I actually was just wondering, Callum, if I could ask you, I haven't seen this film, but I couldn't help but throughout see so many similarities to Wolfwalkers, which I did just recently see. And was wondering how like the forest can be seen as a third space as well, obviously in like different ways, but so many, I just saw so many parallels. It was almost as if you can change the relationship from sea to land maybe, but it was very, like, I just saw so much to compare between the two, and I was just wondering if that's something that you do look at in your work, or you can see yourself doing. You're on mute, Callum, but you can unmute yourself and answer if you want.
Sorry, I couldn't. It was like being in a child-locked car. But yeah, so to go back to the, yeah, your question. So yeah, it's made by the same directors, and it's in actually the same set of movies or kind of trilogy that starts with Book of Kells. So yeah, there's loads of points of comparison, and I think Wolfwalkers is a super good movie and really interesting from loads of perspectives, and I'd love to see it more as a way to teach colonialism and to teach also the intertwining of like environmental issues and coloniality. And also, I think it's really in terms of the second talk from Sahar, Other Sahar, how it interconnects to land grabbing and the role of the commons and all of this. So in terms of, yeah, the forest is a third space. I think definitely, especially if we start looking at how, I mean, in that movie, and more generally, I think like forests and other kind of wild spaces, I suppose they allow, through providing a natural barrier to early industrialism at least, and even still to the extent in places like the Amazon and so on, they provide shelter for other ways of being, and also because there are lots of, I suppose, like difficulties in living there, force people to kind of think otherwise and think with the nature around them and so on. So yeah, short answer, definitely. And actually an interesting point just in terms of deforestation of Ireland, and I imagine other places, so I'm not as familiar, like part of its early role was to kind of make it harder for rebels or for like kind of, I suppose, anti-English forces to shelter. So I mean, definitely if we think about like being outside of the bounds of certain types of state, yeah, like for sure. So yeah, thanks for the question.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Thank you so much for that, Callum. We have a question from Connor for Sushabon. He asks, I was really intrigued by the quote, "To choose to preserve is then an ethical choice." But he missed the connection of this to diaspora identities. Could you say a little bit more about it? It seems as though this idea of preserving could also play into nationalist discourses that want to restore or uphold an imagined status quo. So Siobhan, go ahead. You can unmute yourself. And
I hope I'm audible. Thank you so much for the question. Yes, so like when I was like writing paper, so to choose to preserve is then an ethical act. So how does it connect to the idea of diaspora? And yes, obviously it is related to the whole idea of nation and nationalism, as like Hobsbawm and Ragnar discuss in their book Invented Traditions. And so window is open, so some noise may be coming, and my apologies for that. So they discuss how nations invent traditions, and they give a lot of beautiful examples on that thing, and they create memories to preserve these emotions that often and more often than not uphold the majority status, the people in power, and the minority identities and minority histories are often erased, or as we have this term, disremembered, like they are remembered in distorted fashion that would suit the majority perspective. So obviously, nationalities do try to preserve their own version of history and their own version of lineage that they can this history. And what I was trying to connect it to diaspora is that when I am in one country, I'm holding the nationality of one country, and I'm trying to think about someone who is in another, who to whom I belong in the diaspora. So people who would be categorized as partition survivors, the children of partition survivors, partition of India, and now they are in the US. And they are trying to reconnect with the history of partition or the lives that were lost during the partition. So it is also in the sense that they are trying to preserve certain identities, and obviously identities, we need to think how these identities are not recognized as identities. When the carnage of life and death happens, something of, in most cases of riots and violence, the human is this need to be disrecognized. Into it is made a symbol. It can be made a lot of things, but it doesn't remain human in the first place. But when I'm taking these identities and trying to imagine a particular history out of them, trying to connect these histories, and I am obviously violating a particular ethics of the borders. I should not remember Vietnamese people because my nation doesn't want me to remember. But then I am remembering this. I'm violating of ethics of the border. So how we are also, by doing this entire thing, which is very politically contentious, we are doing this thing and we're preserving a certain memory that was not there probably, that was probably lost. And in this way, we are trying to preserve we are trying to preserve identities that are lost. And how this entire thing, by taking this dance into the political, is also connecting with an entire discourse of ethics, where I'm choosing to do something which I should not do, which I am not, which makes my own identity as an immigrant, or as a first generation immigrant, very compromised as the other in a country that doesn't want to recognize it. So yes, that was what I was trying to build on when I said that to choose to preserve is then an ethical choice, and how it connects to the diaspora. I hope I was able to make some sense.
Thank you so much. That was I think that answered it quite well, and also actually has raised even more questions, at least in my mind, of taking this conversation even further. Katrina Leahy has their hand up, so feel free to unmute yourself, Katrina, and go ahead.
Thank you very much. That was a great panel. I have a question for Callum that might be just require a one-word answer, but maybe not. So I haven't seen the film either, but I definitely will. It looks great, and you've made it sound really, really interesting. And I'm wondering, really, well, it's a question about agency. So who sings the Song of the Sea? Because it's a very evocative title. And I imagine that there are, two ways of understanding that. Is the sea tempting, siren-like its folk back to it? Or is the song sung from the land by those as a kind of an incantation, a conjuring up of the forces of the sea? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, really interesting question. Thank you, Katrina. Yeah, so it is like, I kind of would see it almost as the two, so to speak. So Saoirse sings it, but needs the coat on and everything else to do so, to actually give it its power. I would see the song in this context as a way to connect land and sea, if that makes any sense. So that, like, through kind of singing it, like, you as a Saoirse, as a Selkie, as a land-based being at that moment in time, can access their other identity through the sea. So in a way, it's sort of like you could maybe see it as like a language, or like a kind of like a way for humans, but forms of humanoids, to connect to the ocean. I think it's also interesting, just while I'm thinking about it, to kind of see how differently it's perceived. So like definitely, like as you're saying, that idea of like the siren song and the idea of it sort of kind of being threatening and like pulling people away, that is like one of the key struggles in that movie. And I think initially for Connor and the grandmother, but I mean more generally, I think like it would be seen not as a positive thing at all, and as the sea as some kind of omnipotent force pulling people in. But folklore is quite interesting in how it deals with that in terms of, certainly in terms of agency. Sometimes that's how it's kind of portrayed, like, oh, the woman's taken away from the man and that's it, you know? But on the other hand, you also have more nuanced stories, I think more from Donegal, but I would need to check, whereby the, sorry, these would also be mermaid stories, but where they come, the woman actually comes back after leaving and to look after the children, but doesn't get back with the man, you know, has her own agency, still retains like a mother, but is also independent and everything else, which I think is quite interesting, especially because most of those stories actually would have been told by women in those communities. Sorry, that's a bit of a rambling answer, but yeah.
Thank you so much, Callum. If there's any more questions, please feel free. Connor raised his hand again, so you can unmute yourself, Connor, or can you not? You can. Great.
I can, yeah. I've been released from the chat lock, thankfully. Callum, I know I've asked you this before, and I'll try to ask it in a better form. I also love your take on Song of the Sea, and it's very like pleasingly utopian. And I wonder whether you think the fact of it being sort of a kids movie, it's like a kids, the different audiences it's targeted towards make it suited to be saying potentially different things depending on the maturity of the person watching it. So I'm wondering whether you think the utopian elements of it are more suited almost to the child audience, and whether there's a kind of tragic, is there also a tragic reading of this that an adult audience might, I'm thinking of the fact that it starts with what seems to be a suicide. I know I've asked you this before and you don't find it a very good question, but for me, it's just something with the, yeah.
Okay, yeah, I don't think I've ever said, Connor, it's about a question. I think it's a good question. And I think the audience question is super interesting in terms of like, even going back to, I think I initially, and I have been trying to think a lot about, is like children, the representation of children and so on. I think it is a sad movie, as you know, it is. And there are definitely like, you can read in terms of almost at the end of a certain way of being, you know, like the kind of, the other epistemology, I suppose, like you can see that sort of disintegrating, and like Saoirse, one of kind of the last holdouts of it. That is definitely one reading. I also think though that you can see it as a kind of sign of hope, of regeneration through like children and through younger people that aren't as burdened with particular ideas of, you know, of the nation, or of, you know, we can look at this in language relations or religious relations or whatever it is. And I think particularly in Ireland, but I suppose, again, it would be really interesting to do kind of transnational comparisons in this sense. I think often early generations immediately after independence are burdened perhaps with this whole idea of quite like one way of being, one way of representing a country, one way of, and certain things get lost in that wash, so to speak. And then perhaps the following generation rejects all of that, and then you end up, you know, kind of eventually where you maybe find solace, and I think Saoirse maybe represents this, and the 2010s in Ireland, I think, are quite interesting just in general as a period, where we kind of have people maybe less encumbered by those, in a sense, chains that can kind of break through. So, right, to relate that all back to your question, basically, I think for children, it's probably, I don't know, I'm not a child. I have used it for teaching teenagers, Spanish teenagers, English. And it comes across quite well, but I think, yeah, like I think it is generally probably would be more hopeful, because that's its kind of purpose, I think. But at the same time, yeah, sure, I think as an adult, it's much more complex if you know more of the history, but I think it ultimately twists that into a positive. I think Wolfwalkers is actually much more, I find that more tragic, actually. I was really angry and sad after watching Wolfwalkers. So yeah, thanks, Connor. Hope that helps-ish.
Thank you so much, both of you. I might actually ask another question. I'm completely taking advantage of being here, but I might ask Sushman a question, if that's okay. I was so as a fan of Fatma Asghar's, right? Like I love her collection. I almost can't decide whether I love the poetry more or the cover art more. Like it's one of those it's very seldom to come across a collection of poetry where you almost read the first poem and are a bit disappointed that it's not as beautiful as the cover art, right? It's so as a big fan of both Asghar and Myung, I was wondering your take on, because I mean you're so right, like the relationship between memory and diaspora and identity is an interesting one to explore anyway, but particularly in the context of the South Asian diaspora, right? And how memory plays a part in there, particularly with the generation of like the partition survivors are now at that stage where they're dying. And there's this rush to try and preserve oral history because we know that they're not going to be around much longer. There's very few of them left now. And I wonder if you found this through your reading of Asghar's poetry or of similar poetry, where a lot of South Asian diaspora poets are accused very often, sometimes I think fairly, sometimes I think unfairly, of being a little navel gazing in the way they talk about identity and memory and place and space. And I wonder if you felt that in the way I'm trying. When I think of Asghar, I try very hard to not think of Rupi Kaur, but it's very hard because of the space that South Asian like brown poets take up now in the discourse. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes. So yes, there is like my entry into Ascot was obviously defined by like I was working on my research and then I was reading on Ascot and I was like that these things need to come together. But firstly, Ascot was not in my research that was planning. I was like these things to come together. They cannot be different. Like this is a very important thing that is going to be. So yes, identity obviously and how it gets into this thing. It plays a very uh, sensitive role where how people are trying to define themselves as something, trying to hold on to something. What I find something very interesting in Asghar is that she holds on to this heritage, as and many people would call it, and heritage can become a bit problematic word, but she holds on to this entire thing, and she's also making something very new in that entire thing. Like I was very stuck with the idea as to when she was writing these poems, she was talking of us, the us is coming together, and she's remembering the victims of, say, certain violence in certain places. But very interesting thing is that the particular congealing, the particular formation of identities as Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, it was something that was defined during the partition. That when the partition happened, people suddenly discovered that, oh, I'm Muslim, oh, I'm Hindu, and then there is this entire sense of betrayal. But Asfit is writing about this very sensitive time where the identities are still in the moment of formation. So, and I'm like moving a bit from your question, but this is like very interesting as to how she's she's like questioning and puzzling this entire thing of South Asian diaspora as to what South Asian diaspora is a very like it's a very vast and it has many kind of diasporas in it. Like which one are you referring to? So yes, when people talk about identity and their South Asian identity, uh, some obviously do, and there is this always this thing as to where you need to make this limit as to you cannot cross this thing. It is now becoming a bit problematic, and something that Marian Hirsch deals very beautifully in the generation of post memory, where she says that people are trying to people are trying to make bonds, but certain bonds can also violate certain ethics, certain identities. We need to be very cautious as to where we are trying to portray, trying to, and going back to Spivak, trying to represent something, and where we are taking on the representation, where we are doing a violence in an epistemic sense. So yes, this is always there, and I have not think particularly in the sense of ask her, because when I was reading her, I was very amazed with how she was like doing all these things. But I think that a close reading may like throw on some more light on this thing. That is a very good question in this sense.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sushman. It hits at my eternal anxiety that I am now becoming South Asian diaspora, which, you know, just makes I have very upsetting feelings about this. But thank you so much. I think unless there are any last questions, I think this might be a good point to end this panel and take a break before the next one. And so with that, I'd just like to thank both our speakers. The third one, we can send our, long distance congratulations for her paper, but thank you both of you for absolutely stellar conversations. I think the papers themselves were so interesting and so rich, but the conversation that has come out after that has really left so much to follow up on. So thank you both very much. And I really look forward to the rest of the day and the panels. I'm sorry, my laptop is dinging just as thank God it was just as we're leaving. But thank you so much. And we'll see you at the next panel in an hour, I believe.
Yes, so as the schedule says, we'll just take a little bit over an hour's break for lunch or whatever meal it is, wherever you are in the world. And yeah, we'll make our way back in then. And just like last time, the room will be open, so you can go out and come back in again, or you can just stay here, not a problem. And I'll periodically be checking the chat just if there are any questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you as well so much, everyone. See you all in a while.